Good afternoon and welcome everybody. My name is Giselle Italian and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Research on Families. The Center for Research on Families' mission is to support natural, social, and behavioral sciences research on issues relevant to families and to disseminate findings to scholars, families, and policymakers. Towards that end, the Gavin lecture series brings nationally recognized experts to campus. In addition, these visiting experts meet with a SURF family research scholar who shares their research interests in order to provide guidance and consultation regarding a grant proposal they are developing to support their current research. The lecture series began in 1999 through an endowment established in memory of Gavin Erickson. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you also to our next Gavin lecture, which is happening this coming Monday. On December 11th, we'll welcome Dr. Stephen Holland from the Department of Psychological Services at Vanderbilt University. His talk is Cognitive Therapy Enduring, or are antidepressants iatrogenic? I've been practicing that word. And it will take place right in the room next door here on Monday at noon, and we'd love to see you there as well. Our speaker today, Dr. Calvin Morrill, will be introduced by 2017-18 Family Research Scholar Dr. Jamie Rowan. I would first like to introduce Jamie. She is Assistant Professor of Legal Studies in the Department of Political Sciences. She received her BA in Peace and Conflict Studies and her PH.D. in Jurisprudence and Social Policy from the University of California. Her research focuses on law and society, transitional justice, international criminal law, social movements, and international and comparative methods. Dr. Rowan is currently working on a proposal to do a comparative quantitative analysis on the purpose and practice of veterans treatment courts. Please help me welcome Dr. Jamie Rowan.
So I'm here to introduce Professor Cal Morrill. We are really lucky to have him here. So Professor Morrill is an Associate Dean at Berkeley School of Law. Prior to this, was at the University of California, Irvine. He was the chair of their sociology department, and before that was at the University of Arizona. What makes Professor Morrill so interesting and important as a scholar is the variety of subjects on which he's written and his capacities for qualitative research methods. So he engages in methods including ethnography, in-depth interviews, surveys, social network analysis, experimental and story-based methods. And if I just describe his 3 books, you'll understand the range of expertise we have in him. This book that he's presenting on today is called Youth Conflict, Trust and Control in a High-Poverty High School, based on 16 years of ethnographic research with a diverse team of research assistants with him and his co-author. He co-edited a book called Together Alone, Personal Relationships in Public Places. And his first book, which I describe to people that this book exists and you should read it often, is called The Executive Way, Conflict Management in Corporations, where he did an ethnography of executives. And that was his doctoral dissertation work, and that book won an award from the Pacific Sociological Association. So today he's going to be talking about this book, and we're just thrilled to have him. I want to add one thing about him for students and for faculty and for people thinking about. Professor Morrill is not just an amazing researcher; he's an absolutely incredible mentor. And so when you're working with someone who doesn't just get what they do and try to make you get what they do, and you mimic what they do, they actually figure out what do you do and how can I help you. It's an incredibly rare gift, and we're very lucky that he is in the academy and he continues to work with such dedication with students and other faculty. Thank you, Cal.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the Center for Family Research for having me out here, and for the University of Massachusetts Amherst to give me this opportunity to talk about our book. It's a great honor, and thanks for coming out on a Friday afternoon. I'll see if I can keep you entertained for an hour and 15 minutes. The name of the book, actually, that Jamie described, and I should say that you're very, very lucky to have Professor Rowan here, a wonderful scholar, energetic, and the kind of work that she's doing, the kind of work that she's published already in her most recently published book, and the kind of work that she's contemplating doing and has underway is just fantastic. It's really significant for the field. So it's great to see you and great to see old friends, and also to not old, but friends who I've known for a few years, and also to make new friends. So thank you very much for all of that. The actual title of the book, it's changed since what you just said. It's actually coming out in February on the University of Chicago Press, a book I'm going to talk about today. It's actually the title you see here called Navigating Conflict, How Youth Handle Trouble in a High-Poverty School. The book tells two interrelated stories. The first is an ethnographic story of the social improvisation through which youth in a high-poverty school handle trouble and conflict on a daily basis, while at the same time contributing to civility on campus. What the book reveals is that violence and aggression is but a narrow slice of the total compass of behaviors and actions that they engage in. It's just a narrow slice of a broader range of responses to trouble. Our study also identifies the mechanisms through which a school can facilitate social trust rather than suspicion, and youth mobility across racial lines and spaces instead of division. These mechanisms, we argue, create a context in which youth and adults can pull in the same direction in navigating interpersonal and intergroup conflict. The second story is a little different. It's about how changes in school policies embedded in a national level social movement reshaped school discipline at the school that we studied along more punitive lines, and interrupted but did not completely destroy the nonviolent youth practices of handling peer trouble and conflict at school. So this is a case study. It's a case study of a place that generates its own meanings and its own practices, and that moderates a variety of off-site influences from the streets, from households, from policies, including policing, that aggressively act on high-poverty neighborhoods and high-poverty schools. Now, I can't go into every aspect, every nuance of both these studies, but I hope to give you a taste, and I hope you'll buy our book, actually, as well, which can be pre-ordered from Amazon right now, right after, even while you're talking, actually. While I'm talking, you could actually order it. It's coming out in late February. I wish I had the cover, but they haven't shared that with us yet. So, I'm going to probably concentrate more on the first story than the second story, although I'll give you some taste of that second story, that policy interruption, that natural experiment. So where we're headed is I'm going to look at some framings and tensions that inspired us and that led us to do this study in scholarly and popular consciousness about urban youth conflict in high-poverty schools and high-poverty neighborhoods. I'm going to talk about our central questions, our site, why this site, why not another site, and methods. And then, to give you a taste of the book, I'm going to go through what I call 5 clusters of ahas from our research that signal in different ways our two stories. Now, throughout the talk, I'll talk about we and our and so on. It's not to use the royal we. I'm actually referring to my co-author, who is Michael Mushino at the University of Oregon, and most recently was at Berkeley for a number of years where we finished the book. And I'll talk a little bit about how we came together to do this collaboration. This is a collaborative project that we did with a field team, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So my reference to our and we is because as I think about this project, I think about it in a collaborative way with Michael and also with other folks on our field team. So this here is when we began the field research for this study in the late 1990s. This is an unusually long time to be in the field. 16 years, and I'll tell you why we were in the field so long. But when we began the study in the late 1990s, and largely continuing to the present, scholarly and popular framing of youth conflict in high-poverty public schools, I think revolved around 3 different sets of intersecting dynamics. The first of these are what I would call intersecting inequalities. Grinding poverty and racism linked with under and unemployment for young men and women of color in urban cores, multiple dynamics of sexism, racism, producing reduced opportunities for young women of color and placing them at the center of multiple power struggles, both domestically and in public spaces, and other inequalities related to being African American, related to being Latinx, related to being an immigrant, and so on. Compounded with those intersecting inequalities was a continuing public disinvestment of public schools especially, but other community organizations. The second dynamic has to do with social control. And this is social control constituted in ongoing grinding distrust and violence, horizontally among youth, but also vertically in terms of institutional violence and institutional distrust on a daily basis. At the peer level, manifesting in things called the code of the street, which is a term coined very famously by the sociologist Elijah Anderson, in which he argued that as the police pull back and engage in a kind of under-policing of everyday disputes, while at the same time an over-policing of certain kinds of activities and an intensification of racialization of policing, a kind of rough street justice develops through which young people understand public places, called the code of the street. Or Victor Rios more recently calling this the code of the state, arguing that in fact this is the code of the street is sort of a recoding, if you will, of a labeling hype that he argues is aimed at youth of color in urban American cities. And then the final dynamic is the erosion of frontline moral authority, either in the face of heavy disciplinary penal practices in which, as John Devine, researcher at NYU, has argued that the police basically, the teachers actually pull back from working with youth and disciplining youth in favor of relying on policing and other carceral practices, or because of attacks on the profession and the unionization of teachers, or because of continuing legal challenges. So there's a whole bunch of factors going on here that set the context for us beginning this study in the late 1990s and even into the present. What it yields from these dynamics is high-poverty urban public schools being seen as toxic. This is a phrase that Bernard Polly wrote in a recent book called Toxic Schools. High-poverty public schools as failing places incapable of facilitating youth safety and youth learning. And these lead to schools sometimes simply becoming warehouses, simply holding youth for a minimum number of hours, and schools becoming key sites for the reproduction of social inequality and violence of the various sorts that I just described. So that's part of the context in which we began this study and even continues into the present. But the very same folks who have contributed to these findings, these very important findings and these very trenchant framings, also see alternative analytic and normative possibilities. Up in the upper right, you see the cover of Victor Rios's, this would be one book ago. He has a new book out, but this is one that he's probably most well known for, called Punished. And there the quote is, the delinquent boys that he studied, and he studied Latino young men and African-American young men in Oakland, California. The delinquent boys felt tension with these non-delinquent boys because school officials and police had pitted them against each other, that labeling hype. So Victor's work attempts to implicate in some ways and reposition these dynamics to sort of understand the relationship between adults and young people in terms of this. Or my colleague here, there on the left, my colleague Nikki Jones, who's at Berkeley, producing a wonderful book called Between Good and Ghetto. The girls valued school and were hopeful about their futures, yet they appreciated the code of the street and presented a tough front. The idea that there may be more of an agentic dynamic involved here with youth, and especially young women, as they move back and forth between multiple codes, the code of the street, the code of what she calls African-American respectability and authenticity, the code of being what she calls a good girl or a respectable young woman. And then down in the lower right, David Harding, another colleague from Berkeley, too often, he writes, social scientists portray young men from disadvantaged backgrounds as feathers blowing in the strong winds created by social forces far beyond their control, and too often popular media portray them as violent predators damaged beyond repair. This idea that young people in this sort of conventional framing of living in high poverty contexts are at the mercy of social forces, and in fact they are. But Professor Harding here suggests that in fact maybe there's more to the story than that. And finally, Martine Sanchez-Jankowski, another colleague at Berkeley, as with many aspects of the social sciences, we know more about what causes violence than what causes it to end. And that's an interesting and poignant point. And then finally, we see a paradox of youth conflict that Elijah Anderson himself, author of this well-known book, The Code of the Street, writes, in the most troubled schools, the street element becomes so powerful that beefs and scores can only be settled by death. In the grip of the code of the street, schools themselves become a staging area for violent confrontations between young people. But, he says, yet, the school is a microcosm of the community, and he says, yet it remains a haven, a place where one can go and expect relative order. So in all of these authors, we see a sort of a tension, if you will, between the conventional framing and questions about how order is possible, how is nonviolence possible, hinting at the relative autonomy of schools and their local communities, hinting at agency among youth, and so on. And so this is where we began. This was our point of departure. Our research questions. 3 simple research questions. How do youth make sense of and handle interpersonal trouble and conflict in a high-poverty urban school? A rather basic question, a descriptive question. What is the role of coercion and violence in these dynamics, and how is the school implicated in the ways youth handle peer conflict? Now, these 3 simple questions, they belie a much more complex theoretical and policy-oriented framing, which I'll talk about the rest of the time this afternoon. But before I do that, let me talk a little bit about our site, and let me talk a little bit about our methods. So this is the site. We call it New West High School. It's in an unnamed metropolitan area in the southwest of the United States. And actually, in the book, we actually don't name the school, but we do name the general area because we talk a lot about the history, the legal history of the state of Arizona, where this school is located in a very large metropolitan area there. And as I note up here, our access is rather unusual. We, in a sense, did not choose our research site for this project. It chose us. And it really illustrates the role of serendipity in field research. That is to say, originally what happened is that the school had a peer project, peer mediation program, and they reached out to my colleague, Michael Mushino, who was then at a different university than I was, and asked him if he would help them get it started again. He called me and said, hey, I've got this opportunity. Would you be interested maybe in doing something on this? And we both, as we talked, came up with the idea of, well, what do we know about the ongoing daily practices that youth in this high-poverty school actually engage in? And it turned out we didn't know much, and there hadn't even been much published yet. In fact, Elijah Anderson's book came out 2 years later. We actually had this conversation in 1997 and began the research then. We were skeptical of peer mediation programs, and so we went into the field not knowing a whole lot about the school other than it was a high-poverty school, and we didn't know much about violence on campus or nonviolence or the outcomes or anything. We went in sort of blind. So this looked like an interesting opportunity, definitely, in a sense, a kind of serendipitous case selection, and it turned out to be far more interesting than we could have ever imagined. The historical context of the school, it was founded during the Arizona Territory, the late years of that period in the early 20th century, and it was founded during a brief period of ethnic fluidity among the upper classes of the territory, and founded actually by Latinx and Irish and German descent families who were land holding, business holding at the time. This is important because during this period in the territory, laws in the territory were not based on, as they would be just a decade later or 15 years later during statehood, explicitly on Jim Crow laws, then in very much flourishing in the southeast of the United States and copied explicitly by the state of Arizona. And it was largely before a more mid and later 20th century racialization of Mexican descent persons during Arizona statehood. The spatial context of this school is amidst urban pockets of high poverty and high violence surrounding it. In fact, this school is surrounded on two sides by railroad tracks, on one side by a series of strip malls, and further to the east, a larger college, actually. But in its area, empty warehouses, old apartment houses, a typical kind of high poverty area. So what kind of in the demographic context, it's a multi-ethnic school, as you can see up there. By the time we finished the research, it had become Latinx dominated, but at the point that we were studying, had about an equal number of white, these are the official categories from the school district, white and Latino, Latina students, and a constant population of African American students, and then Asian Pacific Islander and Native Americans as well. So what kind of a case is this? We argue that this case offers a counter-narrative to that prevailing framing of the toxic high-poverty schools in a number of ways. First, it's a southwestern school rather than a northeastern or an upper Midwest, say in Chicago, or California, say in Los Angeles or the Bay Area. Second, and this is what really piqued our curiosity in the late 90s, graduation rates and standardized test scores were well above the median for the district. This, by any definition, was not a failing school, and it is still not a failing school to the present. Third, the school experienced an average of 3 serious incidents per year in the late 1990s and the late 2000s, with an intervening period that I'll talk about, compared to a median of 16 for the district, and a median of an average, a mean of 7 per 1,000 students in U.S. schools. By serious, what I mean are assaults, major drug busts, mostly about violence. So this, by any measure, at least by official measures, I should say, is the safest school in its district, despite being the poorest school in its district, and even by national standards, a relatively safe campus. And as I note there, 75% free and reduced lunch among the members of the student body. So that's our case. Here's how we studied the case. This is a 16-year longitudinal. I'll tell you why that's important in a moment. Just to give you a sense, I'm happy to answer more questions about the methods, but this little slide, just for a moment, gives you a sense of all the things that we did. We engaged in a sort of large team participant observation with a multi-ethnic, multi-generational, male-female group for the first 4 years of the study. We continued with a smaller team participant observation approach for the next 11 years after that. We engaged in all kinds of different interviews at various points in the project, conversational, in-depth, focus group. We also did a number of ways to engage youth voice. As you can imagine, it's difficult for someone who is older, for someone who is white in a largely non-white context, to engage youth voice. Youth are not very happy to have adults in their business to begin with, and when you're asking them about issues related to trouble or peer relations, it can be even more difficult. And so what we did to meet that challenge was to engage in a number of what we call youth-centered exercises and projects, where we had students write papers for us, draw maps of the school for us, engage in a collective photo project where they take pictures of the school and then write about what they saw and why they took those pictures. And then we had them also, as I said, write stories, 539 of these so-called youth-authored trouble cases, where they talked about their experiences with conflict. And then, of course, we had, from field notes, we had 94 trouble cases based on our own observations out on the field. And then finally, archival materials that allowed us to stretch the study period back to the beginning, even before the beginning of the school, and give us about 100 years worth of context for the research. Okay, so here's the first aha that I would offer. That long-term access enabled us to make multiple shifts in our approach to studying how youth handle peer conflict, conceptually, methodologically, and empirically. The other thing I would say is that staying in one place for a long time led us to our second story, a sort of natural experiment, a relatively safe school, contrary to typical expectations in the popular or scholarly consciousness. And then a policy change in the late 90s, early 2000s, in which a more vitriolic, carceral-like set of disciplinary policies came in that social movement that is known as the criminal justice-inflected safe schools movement. This is a movement that brought surveillance, that brought heavier policing, that brought a lot of in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension. It has an element of zero tolerance in it, an element of quite punitive orientations toward youth, and youth as a dangerous class in it. And that happened from 2000 to 2005, and then we watched the school for a number of years after that. And so a bit of a natural experiment. Before we were there, 3 years before this started, 2.5 years, then the 5-year period of what we call high safe schools period, and then afterward to watch what happened afterward. And in fact, you might wonder, why did you stay so long? 16 years? What were you doing that whole time? And the answer is, we were doing other things as well as doing this study. But we were also doing this study. When this policy change happened, and we talk about this in the book, but I won't talk about it much today, after we'd been on the campus and we felt that we had understood the campus very well, a bout of intense collective violence occurred on the campus that no one could really explain, and we couldn't explain either. And it really shook us up. It really caused us to rethink what we thought we knew, and it caused us to stay a lot longer to try to figure out what was going on, to try to situate the school more historically, both contemporary history and in terms of its deeper history back to the early 20th century. Let me talk about some of these multiple shifts that we make in the book and in our approach. The typical conceptual frame is framing the focus of study as peer violence. In fact, Elijah Anderson in The Code of the Street asks early on in the book the question, why is it that inner cities, African American especially, he's focused on, African American inner cities are so violent? That's his question. We shifted that question to a focus on what we call trouble. That is to say, the way in which youth make sense of hitches, problems, issues in their own peer relations. We also shifted methodologically from analyzing cultural codes and peer encounters to analyzing what we call trouble responses and trouble settings. Our argument, and what we found empirically, is that the way in which youth respond to problems in peer relations or problems with adults or problems with rules and organizations and systems, it is in those responses that the meanings and stakes of what's going on actually comes to the fore. And that we then situate those responses in what we call larger sequences of interaction, trouble strings. Now, trouble strings can go on for days and weeks. They could only be 5 minutes. And we talk a lot about in the book, about how we bound these trouble strings. A string can start out as a fuzzy, ambiguous interaction where no one's quite sure what's going on, and especially in a school, interrupted by class changes before and after school, and so on. And so this is sort of related to a symbolic interaction insight into how one reads and responds, defines the meaning of an act, actually emerges out of the interaction itself. Now, trouble strings also are a visual and methodological tool for mapping out over time and space the sequences and cycles of different trouble responses. The other thing we paid a lot of attention to is language, how it is that youth themselves label different issues, different responses, and so on. Empirically, The typical way that folks have approached this topic is through exploring interpersonal and group context amidst social inequality and institutional distrust. We certainly embrace all of that, but we also paid more attention to sociospatial context. That is to say, the way in which youth and adults relate to different space on campus and space off campus. We reveal and discovered a kind of interactional dynamic we call anchored fluidity. This is youth are able to move from different places. They have freedom of movement in a campus that's largely not territorialized, unlike many high poverty schools studied by other scholars in which the campus is cut up by neighborhood, by gang, by other affiliation, and not the case on this campus. So anchored fluidity is the ability to be in one place, to light in one place with a group, but also move across both spatial and racial and social lines. And we argue that we're studying this amidst social inequality and what we're calling contested social trust and distrust. In fact, as you'll see in a moment, this is a school that we discovered has a fair degree of social trust within it. And that's very different from the typical institutional distrust and social distrust that's found. And I'll talk about what I mean by trust in just a moment. But before that, let's talk a little bit about what trouble means to youth at this high school. These are trouble issues. These are their words. And going around, hustling has to do with the problems of the material world. System stuff, they actually use another word that starts with an S for that. That's in the book. Racial stuff as well, they use another word that starts with an S as well. They use stuff with the adults, but with themselves they use this other word. Beefs, which are all male kinds of conflicts that could involve neighborhoods, could involve gangs, could involve other folks outside of the school. And then drama, which is a kind of catch-all term that both defines interpersonal conflict, oftentimes involving romantic triangles of different kinds, and also sometimes invoking neighborhood identities, but not as often. The interesting thing on this school, as in most high schools in the United States, heteronormativity is a very weighty frame that all youth relate to in different ways, and drama and beefs, certainly with respect to different frames of masculinity, frames of femininity, have to do with this. Drama is, in fact, the most common sort of issue that youth identify, that they deal with. And in fact, dramas are the conflicts that Elijah Anderson and David Harding in their previous works described that oftentimes escalate to violence. Also, let's see who's going to go. There it is. One thing we should note, which is really interesting, is that in 633 trouble cases, both the 94 that we observed and the 539 that youth wrote about with respect to us, only 12% of those trouble cases invoked some kind of racial stuff, some kind of racial animosity. And this is really interesting, and some of that kind of blended into the system level stuff. This is kind of interesting because in previous work, high school surveys in New York City in the 1970s, for example, 70% of students reported witnessing youth violence that was definitely their words, definitely or probably their words, motivated by racism or racial prejudice. 71% in the same set of surveys in New York City reported being the object of peer prejudice. Or another study, the Adolescent Discrimination Distress Index study, reported that 57% of their 177 student participants in a diverse urban school reported being called, quote unquote, racially insulting names. And so 12% could still be impactful. Doesn't mean that the percentages matter, but it's just another clue that something's going on at this school that's a little different than the typical high poverty school. And it comes out in the way in which youth write about and how they act with respect to trouble. So this is a representation of, this is a second aha, about how youth can facilitate everyday peaceable relations via social improvisation. So this is a little table that summarizes some of the ways that youth engage in that improvisation. It's a partial list. It's a mixed typology of eidic and emic practices. And This is really interesting because 46 of the ethnographic cases revolved around what youth call working it out, or what's known in the literature as conciliatory or remedial forms of informal social control. 29 focus on moralistic, which would be more the code of the street type stuff. 19 of the ethnographic cases focus on rule-oriented problems. That is to say, where the school is engaged in some practice that has impacted student life, or where students themselves try to mobilize adults to help them handle trouble. Now, what's interesting about this is that in the youth-authored cases, ninth graders come in and they write mostly about this moralistic orientation. But 12th graders, by contrast, wind up writing mostly about conciliatory or working it out kinds of practices. We argue that this can be a function of maturity, of course, but it also, we relate it back to the previous research, which finds that oftentimes in code of the street contexts, in many high poverty contexts, that as youth get older, it's not that conflict gets less violent, nor that it gets even less deadly, unfortunately. It may get more deadly. And what we document in the book are the peer processes through which youth change in terms of their orientations from transitioning from middle to high school to then becoming an 11th and 12th grader. And through this process of cross-cohort socialization, where older people socialize, older youth socialize younger youth into practices of working it out, we feel, and we have evidence to suggest that that's going on, rather than older youth recruiting younger youth into more violent practices. Now, one of the interesting things you can see, and in the book we reproduce this table, and there's multiple chapters that unpack these practices, but there's an interesting kind of emotional continuum along here as well. And you can see some of the milder emotions associated with working it out, but still difficult emotions to manage, and some of the hotter, more passionate emotions oriented with moralistic kinds of social control. And then you can see the various things that folks do with respect to the rules, how they play the rules or play the rules themselves. And we talk there a lot about legal consciousness and some other dynamics going on there. This is an example of a case, an ethnographic case. This is just an excerpt from an ethnographic case, 4.3 from Chapter 4. This is labeled using titled using the word that was used, ese, which is a Spanish word that can be derogatory when spoken by somebody who is a non-Spanish speaker or not actually trying to speak Spanish in a serious way. This is an incident that we watched in a cafeteria unfold over about 5 minutes. And if you weren't watching closely, you might miss it. You might not even see what's going on. And this is another sort of insight that we have, is that by staying a long time, we were able, our fieldwork team, we were able to discern things that involved sort of social control and keeping the peace in a more explicit way, and other kinds of action. This is a case where a youth, a Mexican immigrant youth, is called out, so to speak, not really called out, but called to, asking them where they live. And so immediately there's neighborhoods involved, there's neighborhood identities, there's race involved, there's ethnicity, and there's masculinities involved, or masculinity in particular. The Mexican guy, Felix, is sitting with his female friends. One of our field researchers is with him as well, sitting at the table. And what this guy does, it's really masterful. He somehow manages to acknowledge his annoyance to his friends, but then also acknowledge the guy who's called him out, an African-American guy named Jalal, all the time while diffusing the situation. And it's sort of a masterful kind of illustration of the kinds of everyday activities that youth on this campus engage in. Now, we're not saying that no youth know how to do this in any other high school, but this kind of deflection, this kind of diffusion was quite common on this campus and happened inter-ethnically, interracially, as well as within racial groups. Well, here's how we represent this thing. This is a trouble string for this case. We use these symbols, the moralistic, the triangle, the circle. There's no rule-oriented stuff in this. And this is another one of our findings. So much of this happens outside of the purview of adults. And it's not to say that adults don't care or that they're absent in this, but so much of the everyday activities involving youth, adults are not explicitly a part of. But they are very much a part of helping to set up the context in which those behaviors occur. Now, this is just to illustrate this. We illustrate a few of these in the book. We actually did trouble strings for every trouble case that we had, not as pretty as this one. But what we use this trouble case to understand is the way in which an interaction unfolds, the way in which there are interpersonal path dependencies as one set of practices regarding social control gets enacted and they get clustered over time and space, and when do they shift, and when do they change, and how do they escalate. And this is how we actually do the analysis. And it allows you to see in a really distinct way the ways in which these practices occur. And one of our findings from the trouble strings is that once a trouble string starts down the path of conciliatory remedial, it's unlikely to be derailed. But contrast that to once a trouble string starts down the path of a moralistic set of social control practices or trouble handling practices, it can be derailed by conciliatory actions. And that's kind of interesting because this is always the problem and the puzzle, whether you're looking at urban youth studies or you're looking at socio-legal studies or so on, is how do disputing processes or social control processes, how do they escalate, how do they de-escalate? Back to Sanchez-Jankowski's question, we know a lot about what causes violence, not what de-escalates it. Now, this is a third aha. Trust and sociospatial relations can sustain youth as agents for peaceable relations. This is one of those maps. This is a youth-drawn map. Call this a sociospatial map. We ask folks to draw the parts of the campus they know well, and put the buildings on they know well, and put themselves on it. And you can see some of the labels. This is Susanna. She's a Latina, Chicana, born in this country, speaks Spanish, has Mexican immigrant friends, Latina friends, white friends, black friends. And you can see some of her labels, this red multiple mentions of me, this kind of interesting. We notice this on the maps. There she is with Mexicans, her label, not ours. And then you see her up by the lockers where white people are. And one of the things we noticed as we analyzed our field notes and as we analyzed these maps is that people move around on this campus a lot during free periods. They move across racial lines. In this case, she told a story about how she shared her abuela, her grandmother, would make tamales. And she would bring them. Sometimes she'd sell them, actually. Sometimes she'd just share them with her friends. And then she'd go up with white people, and she ate what she called this noodle dish. Well, she was talking, as we talked with her, it turned out it was kugel. And her white friends, at least one of them, had a grandmother who made kugel, which is a traditional Ashkenazic Jewish sort of dish. And she would trade tamales for kugel, not Google, kugel. And we'd see them moving around, and so we concatenated these things. Now, it turned out these permeable spatial borders create multiple places for identities to stick. It enables youth to move on and off the front stages, so if there's reputational threats, they can get off that front stage and move to the back stage. And also associated with this is the crossing of racial and ethnic hierarchies, and also kind of fuzzy peer hierarchies in general. This is interesting. Unlike, for example, schools that Murray Milner studied in a well-known study about status in high schools that was published in the mid-2000s, this is a school where hierarchies do exist, and they do exist among some groups. So there can be an in-group and an out-group, but they're somewhat fuzzy, with one exception, and that is between Mexican immigrant youth students and Chicanas and Chicanos. And that hierarchy was something that was interestingly managed throughout the time we were there. And we watched, even in that sort of situation, we watched conciliatory, remedial kinds of practices occur between folks with that divide. Now, these are pictures taken by youth themselves. There's one of those back stages there. Where just a couple of youth sitting in in a sort of a locker room. This is one of the hallways. This is an outdoor hallway. This is as youth are changing for campus. You can see this is an old, very old high school, in some ways, falling down, bricks, exposed pipes, the usual sort of physical challenges. And so youth would move into campus downtown, and from there up the breezeway, what they call the main bridge, to less traveled areas. There, youth can constitute backstages where they can reflect, rehearse, retreat, study, and chill. Now, what's interesting about this, you might think, gosh, going to a kind of a shadowy back room or a bathroom or maybe sitting between buildings, it doesn't seem very safe to be out there. But here's one of the interesting things that we also found that came up. We did a survey of representatives, and anchored fluidity facilitates working it out. We did a survey of youth in the late 1990s, and the survey indicated, bizarrely, we thought, how much social trust there was on campus. And by social trust, what we mean is this expectation of being treated in a reasonable and dignified way. And trust, social trust, we use it as an umbrella term, included institutional trust. There was more or less trust of the school as an institution. It included intergroup trust. There was trust of different groups across different racial divides. And finally, trust interpersonally at the relational level. And so you can see some of the results here. This was based on again, 11th and 12th grade respondents, a representative sample out of English classes that every high school student at this school has to take. And you can see some of the comments that we got. It was an open-ended survey where we asked, how does the school work for you? So we didn't actually foreshadow it by saying, how do you trust the school? We just asked them, and these were some of the comments that we got. 27 comments referencing the school as providing a good education, 33 comments explicitly referencing trust in teachers, and 51 comments referencing mutual trust among diverse peer groups. We also got comments referencing distrust. We also, and most of those were ethnic or racial in kind. We also got comments referencing distrust of the administration. So while students tended to trust the frontline teachers, it wasn't clear how they trusted the administration all the time. So we dug a little deeper. And what we did is we were interested, well, how did the school come to this situation in the late 1990s? So we contextualized the school historically. And what we found in coding up 100 years of yearbooks and other materials, archival materials from the city and from the school, is that the school has a long-standing history of inclusive social clubs that adapt to changing times, and that we also found evidence of broad opportunities for non-white and female leadership at the school from its founding. And that was interesting. In fact, the first two award winners of the school's highest academic honors was a Mexican descent individual. Her parents were from Mexico, and this is in the early 20th century, and the daughter of Irish immigrants. And so this was from the very beginning, and you might say, well, that's not unusual because there was actually a higher percentage of young women who went to high schools in the early part of the 20th century. Yes, but what's interesting, if you go back, you look at other historical accounts of schools, even with that higher percentage of women attending schools in some high school contexts during that period, still men tended to be more in leadership positions with respect to student clubs and be awarded academic honors more often. And so what we argue is that, we take this from Doug McAdam and Rob Sampson's work, who argue that collective civic action, the act of coming together into groups, to organize collective activities at the community level, can lead to social trust across these divides. And we sort of import this idea into the school, and we argue that over the 70-year period in which this has existed at this school, that organizing a dance, a fair, a concert, a series of meetings, or even something like a daycare center, which was done, could in fact help instantiate the kind of social trust that we saw at the school. It helps to develop this kind of activity, helps to develop empathy. It helps to break down stereotypes. It's not perfect. It's difficult group work. Youth don't always want to work with each other, but we found this long-standing tradition, and again, coding up 100 years worth of these student club handbooks, newspapers, local archival newspapers, and so on. The other thing that we found is that inclusive collective civic action on campus translates into collective action on and off campus. So during the vitriolic student protests in 2006, very against the immigration, the national bills, and then later in 2010, the immigration bill that Arizona was going to pass, the students involved in clubs at this particular high school led a lot of the off-campus protests, work with unions, and work with other immigrant groups to lead those protests. So not only does inclusive collective action, we argue, translate into social trust, which then translates into anchored fluidity, which then facilitates peaceful relations on campus, but it can also translate into collective action off campus, not surprisingly. And here's sort of a sense of the number of student clubs on campus. And it depends on what they're doing, of course, and who's involved in them. The other thing that we talk about in the book is who is involved in these clubs, who's leading them, and what are they doing. And you can see this precipitous drop in the 1980s, which was a period of tumult at the school, by some accounts a period of increased violence as well, and then an increase in the 1990s. Now, a fourth aha. Adults can facilitate or wreak havoc in student efforts at peaceable relations. Now, this is our second story, part of our second story. In the early 2000s, with that carceral-like social movement that arrived on campus and created the Safe Schools policy, we saw an increase in security measures on campus. An open campus became a closed campus. And this is part of the photo narrative exercise, a Latina 11th grader taking this really interesting picture. This is in the book, so is the one on top, of these paint cans as the campus went through $2.2 million worth of upgrades on the campus, which basically led to all this securitization. And she writes, another way I look at this picture is as we, the students, are the buckets. Every one of us is different in shape and color, but the same in one small way. The fence in front of us and the building behind us refers to keeping the students confined to the school premises, only allowing particular students off the premises and movements on the premises, thus illustrating the new closed campus rule the students must conform to this year. And so students were beginning to see and feel this in the late 90s and early 2000s. And this is what happened to police calls on the campus during that period. From a very safe campus, these are police calls. We should say we interviewed the actual people at the police department who responded to the calls, who coded the calls. They were still there at the police department, even from the early 2000s. And you can see this spike, both, I would argue, we argue, a labeling spike and a behavioral spike. Things have changed on the campus. Things did change on the campus at this period, as evidenced by this massive change. Now, in the aftermath of Safe Schools, what happened? Well, this is one of the great things about being so long at a single site. In the aftermath of Safe Schools, as successive administrations reframed, relaxed that policy, we went back onto campus. We were there in 2008, and we were there and we collected some of this. This is from a particular focus group, but these are some of the ways that students were telling us that they handled trouble in their peer relations. Sounds a lot like what we found a decade earlier, even in the aftermath of Safe Schools. So there was some resilience there. This is from the assistant principal, also in 2008. We're not going to follow on the law. We'll figure out this was a law that the state of Arizona was going to implement that would have required that English as a second language learners would be segregated from the rest of the student body until they met certain standards. And what the assistant principal said, we're not going to do that. We found out, years ago that doesn't work. We've got to recognize, we're going to comply. This is a classic case of loose coupling. We're going to comply, but we've got to recognize the dynamic nature of this process. And then finally, this is just another field note excerpt, even closer, further towards the present, 2013. Here's anchored fluidity, folks walking around in clusters, talking with each other. There's a security guard in a cart talking with 4 students, and so on. So we argue, and we use this term neoliberal paternal. We draw it from a book by Sauss, Fordham, and Schramm, a book called Disciplining the Poor. We argue that in the aftermath of safe schools, that there were clues to what we call local social resilience in this neoliberal paternal era. The neoliberal paternal era refers to the idea of both neglect and instilling discipline in the poor via various forms of over and under policing and welfare provision. And there's both a pulling back from the poor and some actual support of poor people, but there's very little amelioration of poverty, and there's a kind of repurposing of government around market-based solutions and so on. So we argue that these elements here give us some clues that frontline and administrative staff buffered the school from outside authority that would disrupt a school that works. We argued that the sociospatial relations that enable movement, the crossing of peer divides, returned. And we also argued that the peer handling of trouble without violence also returned. And we argue that this is kind of clues to the social resilience, the ability of the school collectively to sustain its well-being in the face of challenging broader conditions. And in fact, the last thing that we talk about actually in the book, illustrated by this this chart, which is not in the book, but we talk about it narratively, is that we argue that we need to reconceptualize contested local social, or conceptualize local social resilience at the interplay of trust, sociospatial relations, and control. And the idea here is, rather than sample on violence, look for violence, is to sample more on trust and more on sociospatial relations. The idea is that at the local level, there's an ebb and flow of social trust. There is, at the local level, informal social control may be a source of social resilience for collectivities, especially if it's bottom-up and more oriented toward peaceable relations. And this orientation, we argue, will lead, we hope, to normative ideas and normative policies that will uncover places, practices that contradict mainstream presentations of core urban neighborhoods and their populations. Indeed, it seems in the current era that resources are not coming to these areas. And with the vitriolic administration that we have in Washington at the moment, maybe for more than a moment, I hope not, but who knows, that in this era, we argue that in the absence of resources, which are desperately needed, we argue that there's a period of intensifying punishment and marginalization of the poor. And so neighborhoods and schools may have to look toward each other to find collective solutions to collective problems at the local level. And so models of local social resilience, ways in which collectivities can sustain their well-being and thrive, may become the key dynamic that we need to look for in the future. So with that, I'll open it up to questions that people may have. Thank you very much. Go ahead. Yeah, Laurel. I think you're being recorded, so do you have to, maybe you can pass
Great.
that around.
Thank you. That was really great to see the culmination of the 16 years of work.
Yeah.
So when I was in graduate school, I took qualitative field methods from a brilliant ethnographer named Gavin Morrill. And he taught me to be reflexive and to think about sort of the positionality of an ethnographer.
Yeah.
And so I just wondered if you could reflect, I know it's a team project,
Yeah.
but reflect a little bit on sort of the give and take with these, especially with these interlocutors who don't have a lot of power. Like, and
Right.
so how do you give them credit? Did Did you give them other resources? Like, what was
Right.
that like?
Yeah, so we did two things. One is that during our third year in the field, we used a subset of stories that youth had written, and we worked with a curriculum developer to actually design a curriculum that was part of the English department in the school. And we had a social psychologist who was actually not part of our team but worked with us on this. And he did an evaluation of this. And what this curriculum was designed to do was increase youth's flexibility and expand their consciousness with regard to the way they could handle trouble, both interpersonally, intergroup, and so on. And we actually found that the curriculum worked really well, that students reading stories that had been written by their peers about different problems that they had had and how they solved them helped them to expand their ways of thinking about their solutions. And we worked with teachers as well to implement this. And so unfortunately what happened is in the late 1990s, in advance of George W. Bush being elected, the state of Arizona decided to implement a similar program to No Child Left Behind. And so they had this very sort of one-size-fits-all standards-based curriculum that they wanted to implement. And they literally threw out hundreds of these kinds of enrichment programs like ours, even though we provided it for free. And so we never got to implement it further. So that was one way that we sort of tried to give back to the setting and to use student voice and so on. The other way that we did is that throughout the research, we've had various online and offline exhibits of students' photos, of stories that students have written and so on. And one of the difficulties with this is the confidentiality issue, because the school district required that we keep the school's name confidential, which is why it's called New West High School instead of its actual name. And so we skirted a fine line as we had this photo exhibit with the students' names attached, and yet we were not supposed to reveal their names because they were a vulnerable population. So that's really a difficult situation. The other thing was, the third thing that we did was that we invited students sometimes to classrooms and to talk about their experiences with us, with the undergraduates, and to talk with the research team about we call this in ethnography member checks, but there were more than that. We sort of followed practices that Mitch Denier had pioneered, where he invited some of his participants from the sidewalk study to his classrooms. And so we also sort of engaged their voice in that way. The other question you might have is, well, what about maybe they should be part of the authorship? And maybe that's a different way to think about it. And I guess I would say to that I guess the voices in the book, it is multi-perspectival, and there's a lot of youth writing and youth sort of talking about and giving their narratives about things. I would say that the overall frame, I guess, I would take responsibility for it, and Michael and I would take responsibility for it, and that's how I would look at that. But it's a great question. Yeah. I'll take a question. I wonder if we should get you a microphone, because I think this is being recorded. Or I can. Oh, great! Thanks so much.
I can bring it to you.
Talk about power. It's always power. You have to go to the mic in the middle of the room. Stand and deliver.
In the midst of this environment, how were certain students able to stay resilient to fighting or violence in general?
Well, this is one of the stories that we want to tell, that we think that one of the implications of this study, you don't have to stand up, you can sit down if you like. We think that one of the implications of this study is to think about resilience at the social, at the collective level, rather than at the individual level, although they're certainly tied together. So one of the things that this school teaches us is that where you have a school that has a long tradition of inclusive civic collective action and social trust, that's not perfect, that is textured, and there are inequalities for sure, even within a school that's largely students from poor households, that it is the social resilience of the collectivity that enables students to themselves individually remain resilient. So in the school, we describe some instances, for example, one poignant instance where a young woman was killed in an automobile accident, and a very sad situation. And some of the friends of hers wanted to actually go and kill another friend who had been in the car with her, and he was smoking. Ashes got blown into the young woman's face, and then she crashed the car into a brick wall and died. And the other guy was injured, but in the hospital. They wanted to go hurt him. They wanted to go beat him up. And we actually watched as the group actually using I would call it almost therapeutic intervention, informally, convinced the guys who wanted to go hurt the other friend that, hey, come on, it was an accident. This was not a problem. And we watched this over and over again, both with unintentional and intentional acts of violence. So students seem to draw their individual resilience from the social resilience that was around them. So in a way, it's not rocket science. Building a supportive social context is going to lead to more interpersonal support. It's kind of I think, a truism, but it's one that we think has been lost in all of this rush to both carceral disciplining and sort of top-down kinds of disciplining that we see in the contemporary society. This is a good question. I think, yeah, Katie and then we'll. Professor Young.
Thanks for a really exciting talk. I guess, so as someone who knows some of your other work, I feel like in some ways this is like a Cal Morrill retrospective. Like I feel like I can see so many other things that you've done. I can see pieces of legal consciousness and things about, I remember, you talking at some way about sociology of space and place and how you were starting to think about this in relation to a totally different project. And I guess I wondered how having a project that goes, it's sort of a thread throughout your career for the last, 16 years, how that affects you as a sociologist, whether it has, and how it's kind of affected your other projects. And I guess kind of relatedly, how do you know when to stop?
Well, we had to stop at some point because you can't be a geriatric studying kids. So we had to stop. It's a great question on when to stop, but just take the first question first in terms of the thread. No, I think you're right. There is something of a thread running through this. I think one of the differences is that I've never really confronted in my other work is never really done other research. I've done research at the tops of status hierarchies, looking at Fortune 500 organizations. I've done some research in community agencies, but I'd never done research in a high poverty context for this long. And one of the things I'll say that was kind of interesting about this, and this is a danger, I think, is how desensitized you get to a high poverty context. That is to say, you keep going to the school over and over and over, and you forget that all of these kids, and we do note this in the book, most of these kids are working to support their families, they're working multiple jobs as they're a part of these clubs, as they're in and one of the things that also happens is that the school in some ways becomes a home for them. It is a home because their households, their families may be fragmented themselves. Not to say that every family is fragmented, but many that we encountered were. So that was one thing, this sort of fear about this desensitization. I think maybe underlying your first question is maybe a I don't know if this is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems to sort of beg the question of, does the study become a self-fulfilling prophecy of other kinds of theoretical threads that you've followed in other works? And is it really that's not, I don't know if that's what you're asking. Okay. Yeah. It may, okay, well, I don't know if you're, maybe I come from Berkeley, so it's really cynical. I don't know. But that actually, I've thought about that latter question a lot about what's leading what. Is it the data that's inductively bubbling up, and we've got these new ideas, or we think they're new ideas, or is it our ideas that are actually? And of course, you never quite know on that situation. It's always iterative. With respect to the second question was about what was the second question about? When to get out. How do you know when to get out? Well, we actually followed one of the things that we were desperate to do, and I should say this, and we mentioned in the book, we were almost kicked off the campus after about 2000 because of the change in administration. They weren't interested in having us study their new carceral school. They just weren't interested in the study anymore. So we watched the school from afar, we kept tabs, we talked to teachers, we were able to do some observations on school, we watched online as online came online. And then when we got back after the successive administrations, we were able to go back on the school in the latter 2000s. We became really interested in whether or not what we had seen before had been destroyed by the policy intervening. And so it took us about 4 or 5 years to be confident that what we had seen in the late 90s was sort of reproducing itself in the late 2000s. And once we were confident again, we then got out. The other thing that also we decided is that we needed to understand historically why this school was different in some ways, why it was an exceptional case. And it took us about 1.5 years of those 5 years, 4 years from the end of 2008 to the beginning of 2013. It took us about 1.5 years to construct the historical archives, to do the study that way. So it took a while, actually, to do some of the historical work. Other questions? Yeah. I don't know who had their hand up. Maybe, and then we'll go back to you and then to you. Yeah.
First, that's loud. Thank you for a great presentation
Sure.
and a great book.
Yeah, full disclosure, you actually have seen the manuscript.
Yes. I've read the book. It's very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. I am wondering, in reading the book and listening to your presentation, I think the policy implications are really clear for schools and policymakers, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you plan to bring these findings to schools or to policymakers. Yeah,
that's a really great point. Well, we've already begun doing it in some ways. So my co-author, I was lucky. I drew Massachusetts. He drew Hawaii, and I really like being here. Yeah, thank you. I actually have allergies when I go to Hawaii, so even though I'm an old surfer, I'd actually much rather be here because I can't do Hawaii for some reason. But he was just at a conference about 2 weeks ago of policymakers. It was one of the, I forget the name of the conference, one of the lead educational policy making conferences, a smaller conference held at the East-West Center so it's actually international as well. And so he presented the findings. I couldn't go to that, actually. He presented the findings there, and we've already had some requests at the state level to get some of this work out and to think about it. I actually think, and it's one thing that one of my undergraduates said to me, I presented some of this material in a class I teach at Berkeley called Youth Justice and Culture, and one of the students raised her hand and said, you know, not everybody's going to be happy about the policy implications here because not everybody wants people who are different from each other being able to cross lines and collective action and all this stuff. That's not going to fly in this context. So my response to that is I think the policy diffusion is going to be more horizontal across states and communities as they're looking for models in the absence of top-down resources. They're looking for models that they can implement. I'm not saying this is not without cost, both temporally and financially, but I don't think help's coming from the top. I don't think help's coming from the feds. I think in some ways, in some places, they'll fight against this. In fact, when they see I don't know what will be called the trust people or the anchored fluid, probably the trust people. When they see about the trust people coming, they're going to say, don't distrust the trust. I can see the framing now. So it's going to be interesting to see the contestation over trying to get some of these ideas out into the policy community. But I can tell you that the educational policy folks, and they're mostly state level, there were a few federal people, but there were a few DOE people, and Michael said that the DOE people didn't seem so interested in this, but the state people did. Had a lot of state people and a lot of school district level folks who were really interested in this. So I actually think we're going to be able to get it out. It'll get out, first of all, through our books. It'll get out through, we give talks, different ways. We'll have it up in different ways and different websites so that people can find their way to it. We'll probably do the usual interviews and so on. So that's our plan. It's not a systematic plan, like we don't, to do a demonstration project. Maybe somebody will, and we're happy to help with that. That's probably not what we're going to do ourselves, but we'll be happy to help with that. That's where we're at.
Or, and then if you don't mind staying a
Oh,
little bit, if
sure.
other people have
Sure, sure.
questions,
Yeah.
you can come and chat with Carol.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a few questions. I wanted to know if you could expound a little bit more about the beefs, the things that led to very threatening and
Yeah.
death related.
These are all male.
And
oh, sure.
yeah, okay, and then secondly, I want to know about the larger social context. I was not here in the States during the late 90s. When you got kicked off campus, what was going on? Does the prison industry have something to do with this? What about the Patriot Act and 9/11, all of that? Can you address that?
We can, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can actually pretty quickly. So to the latter question about the context was the Patriot Act and the private prison industry was less important than the defense industry. So when the Soviet Union broke up in the late 1980s, we lost a ton. The defense industry lost billions and billions of dollars of defense contracts, but they had all this technology that they had developed, and they had to repurpose it. And what did they do? Lockheed Martin started to sell surveillance equipment to high schools. They then lobbied the federal government to create the Safe Schools Center that was funded during the Clinton administration. The first thing was funded during the Reagan administration, then during the Clinton administration. Not interesting during HW. I guess he was fighting the war in Iraq or something. But the defense industry has been very, very important in driving the safe schools movement, along with the victims movement, which came out of the late 1980s. And when I say safe schools, I want to just be clear: this is not the LGBTQ movement that started in the mid to late 90s, which is about creating safe spaces for all youth, regardless of sexual orientation. This is an earlier movement that's criminal justice inflected. What's that? With the LGBTQ? Oh, the safe schools. It comes out of the victim rights movement, combined with concerned parents about violence on schools, and then spurred in a market situation by the defense industry, and they're creating a market for all the surveillance industry. 1990s, early to mid 1990s. The Patriot Act didn't have much of an influence on this. However, and this is not in the book, although you can't have everything in the book. When we were on campus in 2000, beginning in 2006, 2007, and then in 2008, and then on, one of the longtime informants that we had, one of the longtime teachers there, actually miscoded the securitization of the late 90s and early 2000s as a response to 9/11. And we had to correct him and say, no. It actually started like a year and a half before that happened. And he thought it was a response. So it's kind of interesting. This is another thing about being in one place for a long time. You wind up knowing as much or more about the setting than even the folks you're studying. And he said, oh, you're right. That's right. It started in 2000. Right. That's right. It didn't come later. He thought it was some kind of a securitization 9/11 thing, but it wasn't. Yeah. How did what go away? There were successive administrations that came onto campus, and they relaxed. Yeah, actually, a Latino principal came on and said, come on, this is racialized. This is not going to work, and this is creating conflict and violence on the school. He came from another high school, but he knew of our high school, the high school that we were studying. He said, this is not going to work. This is not helping anything. So he normalized it. So our argument is bottom up, middle out, but it's not to say that principles don't matter, but they oftentimes have to piggyback onto dynamics that are actually ongoing, as opposed to being sort of heroic, folks in the wilderness who are going to take it on themselves. But he was very important in sort of switching the policy and pushing the policy off. And within a few years, they were back to being the traditionally, historically safe school that they had been. Because, as we describe in the book, there was contestation among the teachers to even implement the Safe Schools policy. And in fact, about 3/4 of the teachers favored the traditional historical, and about 1/4 were a group that was self-described as the so-called responsibility group. and they wanted to implement. There was money out there in the late 90s and early 2000s, so they combined the principal who used this as a kind of career jumping off thing. She was able to repurpose old money that had been left over from some bonds, combined it with new Safe Schools money, and then did the securitization. She, by the way, left the school, became the assistant superintendent of the school district. She did very well with this, even though the school was sort of really unsafe when she left it. But people say, before the present era, people say, I don't believe that. But now we see it on a national stage. We see how things can quickly change so fast, where you didn't expect it to happen. This story now seems more plausible given that larger context. Yeah, they implemented those in the early 2000s and also increased and beefed up the police presence.
Well, we're going to close, and again, if you're willing to stay a little bit and you have more
stay.
Questions, please come on up. And we'd just like to thank you, Cal Morrill, for
Thank
a
you so
wonderful
much.
talk and a great
Thank you.
thought-provoking questions. Thank you.